The United States is at a crossroads that have been building to this point for quite a while, and I will try to explain how that looks, at least from this perspective. As the legal effort to overturn the election petered out, 50 to 60 efforts before judges, all of which the government lost, even when the judges were those appointed by the Trump administration, it became necessary for other parts of the ruling groups in this country to weigh in. And one of the most interesting that I want to talk to you about was a public statement made by all living former secretaries of defense. There were 10 of these former secretaries of defense, Republican, some Democrat, and they all got together in order to undermine any movement in the direction of using the military here in the United States to weigh in on one side or another of this dispute of the election. And the secretaries of the defense all agree that the military should not be involved. And I want to read to you the key sentence. There's no role for the U.S. military in determining the outcome of a U.S. election. By 1970, capitalists in the United States begin to realize we have accommodated our working class. And in the consequences of that, their wages are pretty high. Around the world, everybody else's wages are low by comparison. And that's helping our competitors. British, French, German, Belgian, Japanese, and then later on Chinese and Brazil, they all have lower wages. And they're able to charge less for what they produce. And they're outcompeting us as a result. What are we going to do? And the American capitalists did what capitalists always do in these situations. They have to match the competitor, or even better, beat them at it. Well, how are they going to do that? Two ways. Number one, technology. Innovate, replace high-priced workers with machines. That gets you the computer and the robot and the artificial intelligence. Second part of the same strategy, move production from the United States, where wages are high, to anywhere else in the world where wages are low. China had some of the lowest wages in the world back then, 50 years ago, one of the poorest countries on the planet, welcoming anybody who would bring a job over there. And it worked. And American jobs began to disappear, either through automation or through export of the job. And the American working class was suddenly caught in the vice of capitalism. You know, from 1820 to 1970, American workers rode up the escalator of capitalism, never imagining that what goes up must come down. Capitalism has always done that. The places that were profitable are eventually abandoned for the other places. Detroit was once the center of a profitable American capitalism. It's now a very bad shadow of what it once was. Ditto for Cleveland, ditto for Youngstown, Ohio, ditto for Camden, New Jersey, ditto, ditto, ditto. Whole countries can experience that. That's what's happening to the United States. And so wages stopped rising after 1970. Oh, the money you got went up, but when you looked at the prices, they went up too. So your wage didn't go anywhere. American families that had assumed it would always go up discovered it didn't go up. If they wanted it to go up, if they wanted the American dream, the wife would have to go out to work if she hadn't before. The kids maybe, the elderly maybe. Everybody has to work. The family begins to fall apart. Even that isn't enough, and you have to do something you were taught as a child not to do. When you were little, you were supposed to save money and be thrifty. But as you grow into modern capitalism, the only way you can deliver to your family the American dream you promised them is if you borrow your way to oblivion. So that today American workers see their wages going nowhere, borrow to keep up. Borrow for your home, borrow for your car, borrow for your credit card, and the new one of the last 20 years, borrow to get your child a college education. And it's disappearing for the American worker, isn't it? The culture says the government shouldn't help you. Republicans, but also Democrats, hold back. Even in the pandemic we're living through. Trillions given to corporations by the Federal Reserve, but our leaders have to rub their chins. You can't spend too much to help those unemployed. Not 600 extra bucks a week, just 300. What? What? The majority we save on and the rich minority. During the pandemic of the last 10 months, the richest Americans, 600 or so billionaires, have become much richer still, while 60 million Americans had to file for unemployment compensation for some or all of the last 10 months. I mean, this is a level of inequality that you have to go back to ancient Egypt and pharaohs to get something like this. And the American working class isn't stupid. It sees it all. It understands what it means that Jeffrey Bezos has a 600-foot yacht that is going to be the base for the moon rocket he is paying for to go and see what the moon looks like, while you are wondering about your job. The American people understand that they have been had, that what was promised to them is not being delivered. What they promised to their children will not be available to those children. It isn't now. And there's no prospect of that coming back. They understand that the monopoly in our politics, two parties that keep everybody out. This is a country that prides itself on not allowing monopolies in business, but allows those two parties to monopolize. And they do. And they're very rich, and they're paid for by the donors who are the big capitalists, as they always were. And so people understand they're not our politicians. These are not people who really work for us. They work for them, those that are getting richer while we aren't. And of course it makes people bitter and angry. Now, in their bitterness and anger, could they go left? Could they go right? Yeah, they could go either direction. But the left was destroyed after World War II. It hasn't been in the public discussions. It's not allowed in the university 99% of the time. It doesn't show up on television or in the newspapers. Meanwhile, the right wing, all over the place. So of course, an angry working class, deceived, betrayed by the end of what they thought was built in, by a capitalism that has abandoned them for machines and other countries, and could care less. They don't know where to turn. So when a politician sees that, an opportunistic politician, then it'll be tempting to ride that wave, to talk about that anger, to validate that anger, to say that all the other politicians are awful. I'm the only one. All the other forces in society are betraying you. I can and I will save you. And you might as well try me. I'm at least saying what you feel. The others pretend that there's no such feeling that has any validity at all. So yes, they voted for Mr. Trump in 2016. And no surprise either. Think about it. It's only surprising it didn't happen before. But now let's look at what did happen in these 4 years. What did Mr. Trump do? And the answer is sad. Just like the spectacle of those folks rampaging in the Capitol and not knowing what to do when they got in there is fundamentally, in my view, sad. Not just outrageous, but also sad. Here's what Mr. Trump did. 3 things. Number 1, he showed that he was a Republican, just like all the others. His first great act was the December 2017 tax cut for corporations and the rich. An immense tax cut. Let me drive home the remarkableness of that. Number 1, it came at the end of a 40-year period during which income was lost by the middle and the bottom and redistributed to the top. Corporations had a better run between 1970 and 2017 than they had ever had in a comparable period of time in American history. The stock market rose like a rocket in the 80s and 90s and into the first part of this century. The last thing the wealthy and the corporations needed was a tax cut. They had been doing spectacularly. It was the mass of people whose wages hadn't gone up. It was the mass of people that were falling behind. They needed massive help they didn't get. The people who got massive help were the ones who didn't need it. Extraordinary. He gave the corporations a tax cut worth billions and billions. The second thing he did was to deregulate everything. That's basically what his cabinet appointments were there for. You're the head of education, you're the head of transportation, you're the head of Homeland Security, whatever it is, dismantle this government, free up enterprises to do all the things that regulations had stopped them from doing. A wonderful gift to business. The tax cut, deregulation. I told you there were 3 things. What was the third thing? The third thing was the follow-up of the first 2. Because you were helping the people who didn't need it, and because you were not helping the people who did, whatever you said, you weren't changing their situation in a fundamental way. If you got people jobs, they were jobs at the low end of the pay scale. Yeah, better than no job at all, but no fundamental change in their inability to get that American dream that they had been told would be available to them if they worked hard. So you had a lot of anger building up. And the third thing Mr. Trump did was to manage that anger. How'd you do that? Political theater with some real ugly components. First, you deflected the anger of people at a system that had betrayed them. You deflected it onto poor Central American immigrants and their sad children. You spoke of an invasion. You spoke about them as if they were insects carrying a disease. You ignored their families. You ignored their minimum human needs. You conveniently forgot this is a country made up of immigrants. Unspeakable fascistic mentalities. And you also deflected anger onto others who were, like the immigrants, foreigners. Always the sign of a cheap politician. Scapegoat the foreigner, the one who doesn't vote in your election, the one you can demonize at virtually no cost. So he demonized Mexico and Canada for cheating us. Then he demonized the Chinese for everything he could think of. Then he demonized the Europeans. They were also cheating us. This image of the United States as the victim of everybody else not playing fair, that's exactly what the working class felt. He could identify. You're being cheated, you American, like us or the Chinese are doing this. Brilliant. Give to the rich real wealth. Give to the poor scapegoats to hate. And treat them like they weren't quite human. Bitter. He did that. And that's why he was allowed to be the president and allowed to stay in the president's position. The corporations loved it. He delivered a better tax cut than previous Republicans had been able to do. Yeah, it was a little bit uncomfortable the way he treated those immigrants, but the big businesses were easily persuaded that deregulation plus tax cuts makes it all right. And so it was throughout the first 2, maybe even 3 years. But then the slow percolation of bitterness that wasn't going to the right. People who really suffered over the last 10, 20 years, even more. African Americans who lost the only property and wealth they had accumulated, their homes, in record numbers after 2008. Young people who were not discovering the jobs that they had borrowed money to go through college to get. And even if they got the few jobs, the income would never allow them to pay the debts back, let alone live a life. The young, the non-white, the victims began to discover the critics of capitalism and vice versa. And there begins to be that bubbling up of something on the left. I'm part of that. You are part of that. That's why we're talking to each other. And that made a problem. It was the beginning of a demonstration that Mr. Trump's behavior, good with the tax cut, good with the deregulation, good with the deflecting mass anger and bitterness away from capitalism, away from big business, and onto other scapegoats. This might now produce a blowback, a problem, a contradiction. The first inkling of it had happened before Trump was called Occupy Wall Street. The second sign of it was this remarkable event that Mr. Trump noticed in 2016, that there was a Bernie Sanders, and that when you said socialism, he didn't run away. He didn't deny, yeah, I'm a socialist. Big deal. And it turned out, and it showed that even more in 2020, that millions and millions of Americans were angry enough about what they could see and feel and experience about capitalism that socialism looked pretty interesting, worth an investigation, not to be dismissed out of hand. Uh-oh. To the American business community, this meant, we may be coming to the end of our use for Mr. Trump. He may have outlived his usefulness. After all, we have gotten from him the tax cut we want, the deregulation we want, the scapegoating we benefit from. And maybe now, if he's beginning to produce a backlash, we had better shift sides, be friendly to the backlash, so when the Democrats come in to replace Mr. Trump, we will be their friends, and we will get from them maybe not all we got from Mr. Trump, but most of it. And he won't be able, or we will persuade him not, to undo much of what Mr. Trump did, just enough to keep his own people happy. And by the way, if Mr. Biden can't keep the lid on the situation, we will go right back to Trump #2 if we need to. Because after all, that's what we did when we brought him in, and when we let him stay there. That's where the United States is. And the frustration that you saw on January 6th has been building for 40 years. It's a frustration of people who know their situation is being sold down the river. There are no good jobs for them. There is no recovery for them. They're bitter and angry. That's why they do the kinds of irrational things that overly bitter and angry people do. They've been told so many things that didn't turn out right, that turned out to be ways for someone to make more money, that when the government says, come put a mask on, they've had it. It's that last straw. They won't do it. It's exactly the same as saying, I've had it with the government telling me what to do. When I drive my car through an intersection, I'm not going to be told when I can drive with a green light and when I can't with a red light. The effort to explain to them that's the only way we're all going to get through intersections alive, it's not that they don't understand it. Of course they do. They always have. But they are at a boiling point. Not wearing a mask is craziness. Climbing up the Capitol's wall, that's craziness too. But it would be a terrible mistake to give it some abstract theoretical explanation without understanding its roots in genuine, real, lived experience. That's what makes those people think and act the way they do. And if that isn't changed, they will continue, and their neighbors will, and their children will. Here's the real punchline, the conclusion to draw from everything I've tried to say. The Biden administration coming in has got to make fundamental structural changes in the United States. Otherwise, what has been going on for 40 years will continue to go on. How do I know? Because of what's happened. We have become a more unequal society every year for 40 years. Uninterrupted. Republicans, Democrats, made no difference. Oh, the pace was faster now, slower then. But the pace is no longer the issue. It's the reality of where we are. You can't have another little policy over here, an adjustment of the taxes. We're beyond that. I can tell you in advance, too little, too late. No matter what you do, you have to change the basis of this society. Why? Because if you don't, if we take seriously what the Biden administration tells us, both in its words and in the names and the natures of the people it has appointed to the highest offices, they are people who want to, in their words, go back to the pre-Trump normal. The pre-Trump normal is how we got to Trump. And if you go back to that, you are creating the process that will deliver to us the next Trump. Whether his name is Cruz or Hawley or Trump or Pence really doesn't matter. You can't do that. That's a policy that makes no sense. But when I say basic changes, here's what I mean. You've got to do something now to alter and end the absurd and obscene inequality in this society. That's not going to be done by marginal tax rate changes or giving everybody $2,000 or any of that. You have to change the system. We now have a system in which the distribution of wealth and income is determined by the employers. They're the ones who dispose of the discretionary money in this society, the profits. They pay their workers as little as they can get away with. They accumulate the profits, and then they distribute the profits to the shareholders as dividends, to the top executives as pay packages. You know the story. As long as we allow a rich minority to decide how to distribute the discretionary wealth, they will end up and continue to do what they've been doing, which is giving it to themselves. And if you want a different distribution, you've got to make a different distributional system. Here's how you do it. You democratize the enterprise. It's a democratic decision how you distribute. Will then the democratic decision of all the workers, one worker, one vote, decide to give a tiny number of people vast amounts of money while everybody else cannot afford to send their kid to college? Will not happen. Never has, will not now. That's a fundamental change. That every worker will understand. That will be tangible right away in the redistribution of the product and of the wealth. That will show that we now have a government that is fundamentally different. Not the same old Republicans and Democrats. And not the opportunist Trump who rides dissension into office, makes it pay for himself, leaves in a burst of vainglorious theater, only to have the society lapse back. That is a disaster. Let me conclude with a historical parallel that may teach the same point. The German working class, about the same time that the American working class experienced wonderful growth after the Civil War in this country and after the unification that produced Germany around the same time in Europe. From roughly 1870s into the First World War in 1914, German economy boomed. Workers' standard of living rose. But then the working class of Germany, which thought it was an ascendant working class, was subject to three terrific blows imposed on the working class by its elite political and economic leaders. First was the declaration of World War I, which the Germans lost. Terrible blow, end of the Kaiser, end of Imperial Germany, unspeakable. 3 years later, they had one of the worst inflations in human history. At the end of 1919, the war now over, one US dollar was worth about 45 German marks. 3 years later, the end of 1922, $1 was worth 7,000 German marks. And a year after that, late in 1923, $1 was worth, ready, 4 trillion German marks. Prices were doubling every hour at your neighborhood store. The savings accumulated by German families from the 1870s to 1920, that were their bedrock, that were their security blanket, that money slowly accumulated over the years was in a matter of months made worthless. 50 years of savings bought you a quarter pound of butter. The blow to the German middle class greater than what World War I's defeat meant. And then, in some ways the worst of all, the 1929 Great Depression hit Germany. 3 blows, a lost war, an inflation, and a Great Depression. It drove the German working class crazy. Half of them became radical socialists and communists. And the other half became another kind of socialist, because the Trump types in Germany knew they had to call whatever they did socialist if working people would give them any attention at all. So they came up with an interesting gambit. They were national socialists to distinguish them from the very old and well-established Socialist Party, which were their enemies, and the Communist Party, which were their enemies. N-A-Z-I are the first 4 letters of the word national in German. That's why they're Nazis. And they went to the capitalists and said, you know, you're a minority. You don't have any mass support. You don't have a mass base. The communists and the socialists are saying, you're the cause of the problem. You declared war. You manufactured the inflation, and you are presiding over the crash of capitalism, your system. They're against you, and they're going to win unless you get a mass base in a hurry. And the only available mass base for you is us, the organized Nazi political party. And in January of 1933, the president of Germany, following their rules and constitution, invited Adolf Hitler to form a government because the business community had sent him a letter saying, we have to choose between these two, and we choose the National Socialists, not those socialists and communists who are critical of capitalism. And that brought in Mr. Hitler, who proceeded to destroy the socialists, the communists, and the unions, literally and figuratively. And the rest is history. Back in 1923, Hitler was in a rush. He thought he could accelerate and rush the process. So he and a bunch of young white men, looking an awful lot like those who took over the Capitol on January 6th in D.C. They took over a building in downtown Munich, Bavaria, as the first step in what was planned to be a takeover of the entire German government. Things didn't work out. The police and the military arrived. Hitler was arrested. He was tried. He was found guilty, and he was put in jail. And he spent the next almost a year in jail before he was let out. He learned something. He learned that this kind of a attack on a building full of big noise, and that was not the way to succeed. That was the way to land in jail. You have to organize a political party, a social movement, until you're big enough that they have to deal with you, that they don't dare bother you, arrest you, imprison you, or anything else. In 1923, no one ever heard of him. He was sitting in a jail in Munich. 10 years later, in 1933, he had done the organization. Why? Because the capitalist system of Germany only got worse in the intervening 10 years. Liberals, socialists, and others frittered around the edges. They didn't make basic changes. So Hitler's base, what he had started with, it only got larger. The suffering of the mass of Germans only got deeper. And then the Depression hit. I tell you this story not because Hitler and Trump are the same. They're not. The point is not that they're identical. The point is that there is a lesson. If you don't make the basic changes that are causing these social divisions and crises, they will get worse. If Mr. Biden chooses to continue to be the kind of central Democrat, middle of the road, spokesman for the corporations that have been the dominating force in his home state of Delaware his entire life, then he will be recreating the conditions, presiding over the deepening of the conditions that produced both Mr. Trump and those disastrous events at the Capitol. Only the next time, those folks who cheered that on will very likely have learned better ways to go about the same tasks aimed at the same objective. The United States is at a crossroads, at a tipping point. But unfortunately, most of the people, even those shocked by the events of January 6th, practice denial more than they practice confronting what the issues are, what the history has been that brought us to this point. A last comment. Much of the commentary in the United States about the events at the Capitol in Washington on January 6th speak in terms of how that was a threat to American democracy. You hear it all the time. Well, that's an example of what I mean by denial. What in the world does American democracy mean? We have two political parties that operate a total monopoly. No other party can function under the rules imposed by that monopoly. What democracy are you talking about? In the workplaces of America, the factories, the offices, the stores, what is the system that governs the workplace? The place where humans in America spend most of their adult lives. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of those 5 days are at the workplace. Workplaces are not only not democratically organized, they are the antithesis of democracy. In your workplace, your boss, the employer, tells you what to do, tells you how to do it, tells you where to do it, tells you what the raw materials are, tells you what machines you will use, and at the end of the day, you leave behind what you've used your brains and muscles to produce because it belongs instantaneously to the employer, not to you. If you don't like this, the employer can fire you, take your job, take your income, plunge you and your family, your community into whatever difficulty that means. What power have you got over the employer? Nothing. The employer is not accountable to you. You don't vote for him or her. It's no democracy. If you believed in democracy, you would have installed it in the workplace long ago. Instead, democracy has been excluded from the workplace. You have elections, but to them, to the two-party system in which the between the parties becomes more difficult over time to discern. And on the basic questions, there are no differences. That's why they all vote for the defense budget, as I pointed out earlier. This is not a democracy. It hasn't been. That's a task. That's a project. And it would be a good response to the attack that we had on January 6th.